Since 2005, the UK's per capita electricity generation has fallen by 22%. This has also coincided with a period of rising electricity prices and a long period of economic stagnation, with economic growth falling behind past trend rates. Now, definitely there are many other factors behind the UK's poor economic growth, but it is fair to say that rising electricity costs are a factor in both harming UK households and UK industry. UK industrial electricity, one of the highest in the world. Now, in recent years, electricity-intensive industries like chemicals and manufacturing have really struggled, with British steel companies paying up to 50% more than European competitors. It's really no surprise that they are struggling, and this has led to the perverse situation of the government subsidising uncompetitive firms when the better alternative is to reduce electricity costs at the source. But unfortunately, there are many broken incentives in the British electricity market. Since the early 2010s, the government have been encouraging offshore wind production. In fact, in 2024, wind accounted for 30% of all energy created in the UK. It's a natural resource, it has a low marginal cost and reduces the need for costly energy imports. But there's a big problem with offshore wind. It's one thing to generate wind power, it's another thing to make use of it. The wind industry responds to the national price of electricity, so it likes to set up in windy places like the coast of Scotland, which accounts for nearly 50% of all wind production. But the problem is that demand is far greater in southern England. And so we have a situation where it's like trying to empty a very large tank with all this wind energy in Scotland through a small straw. There isn't the infrastructure to get it to the south where it is needed. Now, because the wind can't be used, the wind producers are actually paid to turn off the wind. At the same time, the UK may need to power up gas-powered stations in the south to meet a production where demand is greatest. According to Wasted Wind Tracker, by July of 2025, the UK has already wasted 711 million in turning off wind and turning on gas, a 50% rise on the previous year. This is a map for a windy day in February, showing the yellow circles where wind farms are being turned off. The UK's largest wind farm, Seagreen, completed in just 2023, is currently being paid to turn off wind generation 71% of the time. Curtailment payments currently make up 2.4% of a typical annual bill, around £42 a year, but that is set to rise. Now, a wind producer is guaranteed an administrative strike price for up to 20 years. If prices fall below the guaranteed price, energy suppliers and consumers pay the difference. To encourage more investment, the maximum price has recently risen from £113 in 2025 compared to £104 in 2024. Now, this is a maximum price. The actual price in auction may be lower, but it does reflect that the cost of turbines has actually increased in recent years, because to keep increasing supply, you tend to have to increase price to attract ever more investment. The truth is that offshore wind does have some diminishing returns, especially when the energy created is so far from where the demand is. Now, in recent years, supply disruptions have played a role in increasing the cost of traditional fossil fuels, and with gas having a large role in determining the price of electricity, this has led to both higher gas and electricity prices. Now, however, whilst wholesale prices are definitely a factor behind recent price rises, it's also worth bearing in mind there has been a rise in the cost of grid stabilisation over the past 10 or 20 years, and this is a hidden cost of integrating renewable energy sources. Another feature of renewable energy is that the greater share of renewable energy you have, the more difficult it can become to add into the energy mix. So the first 10% is pretty easy and cheap to integrate into the national grid, but to go from say 60% to 80% is more expensive, and often because it's harder to store and provide power to where it is needed. You need more energy infrastructure. The UK lags behind. And you can see here that the final price has actually increased more than the wholesale price. So although gas prices are important, it's not the only factor behind rising energy bills. And a report by Energy UK estimate that by 2030, a typical bill will see transmission, distribution and curtailment costs increase as a share of your bill, because all these costs do get passed on to consumers through higher bills. Now, one solution to this perverse incentives we see is regional pricing. It would lower prices in windy areas. In the long term, it might encourage some energy-intensive industries like data centres to set up near energy sources. But more importantly, it would discourage excess investment in generating wind energy where it's not really needed. Now, unfortunately, the government rejected this quite recently for fears southern bills may rise. But it does lock these perverse incentives to build wind energy where it's not needed, and that will affect bills in the coming years. If you do rely on the market, then you need a proper market with proper incentives, rather than subsidising production where it's not needed. Now, in recent years, the share of renewable energy has increased, and that does have some benefits in terms of lower energy imports. But if renewable energy is so cheap, why are prices rising? Well, renewables are not really determining the price of electricity in UK wholesale markets. In the merit order of electricity generation, the price of electricity is determined by the energy mix needed to meet the last 1% demand. And the low marginal cost of renewables is of limited value when you can't rely on it to meet that last bit of demand. So does this mean that all renewables are a waste of time and we should cancel all renewable contracts? Well, it's more nuanced than that. China certainly doesn't think so. It is surging ahead with the installation of renewables, solar in particular. Global installation of solar is far exceeding past forecasts, largely because the growth of the industry has led to a persistent cut in costs. It's now becoming as cheap to buy a solar fence as it is to buy a wooden fence. But whilst solar costs are plummeting and on a long run downward trend, offshore wind costs aren't plummeting, and in fact in recent years some of their costs have actually gone up. Also, the UK's latitude, a bit too far north, means that solar energy is of less value in winter when demand is really high. Australia is aiming for 100% renewables to fund their electricity, and there's no doubt that they will get there at some point. But Australia has certain geographical advantages over the UK. Large amounts of land, ideal for solar panels. Geography really matters. And by the way, those who say the future of UK energy is North Sea oil, unfortunately, basically on its way out. I wouldn't object to a few more oil projects, but it's not going to make the UK energy independent, unless you start fracking around the Lancashire and Yorkshire borders, but that of course has its own costs. Now, going back to falling electricity supply, this actually was slightly misleading because it also reflects falling demand, because certain improvements like, say, LED lights use much less electricity. They're much cheaper. More efficient insulation can also help reduce energy use, and these are good things worth implementing. However, whilst this approach definitely has merit, there is always a danger of being a bit too austere in reducing demand rather than going for energy abundance and low price. Now, as you probably noticed this summer, the world is heating up. Temperatures are rising, especially in the UK. And ironically, this is part of the logic of net zero, try to reduce CO2 emissions, keep a lid on global warming. However, the UK has become very anti-air conditioning, with builders having to prove they've exhausted all other options, despite many modern buildings suffering from heat capture. Now, the result is that the UK has very low rates of AC, less than 5%. Yet, when it is hot and sunny, there is actually an almost free source of energy. The UK has also increased solar energy installation. But again, when it's really sunny in summer, firms have often been paid to turn it off because we don't need the power. There's an overload to the grid. So ironically, using an AC would actually help the energy grid cope with this surge in solar energy when it's sunny and hot. So this kind of hair shirt environmentalism, suffer in the heat kind of approach isn't really necessary. When temperatures go above 23 degrees, productivity declines. Mine certainly does, but there is a solution. Also, if we look at the rest of Europe, the link between renewable energy and pricing is mixed. Some countries with very high levels of renewable energy also have low costs. Though you do have to be careful, because the real boon for, say, Norway is hydroelectric power, which is both cheap and stable. It's almost like the perfect renewable energy. Now, the other rather dubious investment is that of £22 billion spent on carbon capture, and costs may rise in this as well. The idea is that to meet CO2 targets by capturing carbon and storing it underground, and the cost of this is borne by a quarter of the Treasury and three-quarters household bills. But scientists do say the technology is somewhat unproven, with some wondering whether it makes any difference at all. And arguably there's much better ways of spending £22 billion. Introduce regional pricing, remove the electricity levy tax, and make sure everyone's price goes down would be a big help in getting a more effective market. It is worth bearing in mind there are definite solutions to this problem. Regional pricing would help reduce perverse incentives. It would also help reduce bills and avoid firms gaming the system, like this former wind power producer admitted that they gamed the system to get fixed amounts of income. But another thing is that renewable energy is only as good as storage and transmission. Offshore wind generation in the UK is racing ahead of the ability of the UK to really use it. Another solution is flexible pricing, and the aim is to encourage households to use when the grid has excess energy and use less when there's a shortage. So this does require a smart meter, but it would help balance out the grid and avoid these need to pay for very expensive gas, and also use the surplus power that we are generating off-peak times. So basically you would have an incentive to wash your clothes at an off-peak time when electricity is cheaper, rather than at peak demand when the country is short of power. Another thing is better cooperation with Europe to export UK's excess energy and import cheaper from Europe. Moving levies of household electric bills would help households to increase incentives to invest in heat pumps, electric cars. Now, Great British Energy, a new government body, is looking to invest in storage solutions, which will help in the long term. But the long-term storage technology is still somewhat in its infancy, and is expected to have limited impact, at least in the next few years. Now, there is some good news. The battery technology is on an ever-improving cost curve, but lithium batteries are not currently a realistic solution to long-term energy storage the UK needs. If ever an industry would benefit from nationalisation, I think it would be aspects of the UK energy industry. Rather than paying extortionate prices to turn on gas turbines, increasing the price of all electricity, government-run powered stations supported by offshore gas storage would do a lot to help improve the grid. Investment in nuclear power does provide more energy stability. It's a good complement to the more volatile energy renewable sources. The problem, though, of course, is that UK's building costs are amongst the highest in the world. Renewables is a hot political issue. Some say they're wonderful and solve all our energy problems. Some want to go to the other extreme and cancel all renewable projects. But it is much more nuanced than that. It depends how they are integrated into the energy system. They can work, but they need to be introduced only when the infrastructure is there. If you get ahead of yourself, then you get these broken incentives to increase supply where it's not really needed. So the government could take steps to reduce energy bills, and it's worth doing because it would be one of the most popular policies. You can reduce energy bills is one of the most popular things that people actually want to see.